Masechet Menaḥot Daf Gimel. In the first Mishnah, we learned the principle that if a Kohen does kemitzah on a Korban Mincha, shelo lishma, he has in mind the wrong type of Korban Mincha, then it's valid, but it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. That's true for most Korban Mincha offerings. Then we saw the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who seems to disagree with the Mishnah because he said that there's a difference between Zevachim and Mincha offerings. When it comes to Mincha offerings, Ma'aseha mochichin aleha, the action that you do even before Kemitzah proves what type of mincha it's going to be. Either it's going to be raw, or baked, or pan-fried, or deep-fried, so you can see what it is before the kemitzah. Therefore, since it's clear what type of korban mincha it is, that action overrides his intention. And so that's what we say, that ma'aseha, the action, overrides the intention. It proves what it is. In Zevachim, that's not true, because in general, when it comes to animal sacrifices, we're going to start asking questions about bird sacrifices. But in general, animal sacrifices, bird sacrifices, it's usually not so clear at the time of shechita what kind of korban it is. We're going to see some exceptions today where it does seem to be that based on the placement or the details of what he's doing, maybe you could figure out what kind of korban it is. But usually not, and therefore Rabbi Shimon makes that distinction regarding zevachim. If you do it in shelo lishma, then it does not fulfill the owner's obligation. But korban mincha, it does fulfill the owner's obligation. Good. Then we saw a second baraita where Rabbi Shimon says the opposite. He compares the mincha offerings to an asham, and therefore says they do not fulfill the obligation of the owner. So we had Rabbi Shimon number 1 who's lenient, Rabbi Shimon number 2 who's stringent, and we cited already the first response, that of Rabbah. He makes a distinction. He says Rabbi Shimon is lenient. The first baraita is when the Kohen makes a mistake in Shinui Kodesh. He has in mind one type of korban mincha. He has in mind pan-fried, but really it's supposed to be deep-fried. There, the action makes it clear what type it is. The second baraita, which is in agreement with the Mishnah, is in the case of Shinui Be'alim. It's actually not in agreement with the Mishnah. The Mishnah made clear it's talking about a difference in Kodesh. So the second baraita of Rabbi Shimon, where Rabbi Shimon agrees that it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner, is when the Kohen has the wrong owner in mind. That you cannot tell just from looking at it. And so now we see the principle of Rabbi Shimon. It depends. If you can tell, here's a good summary of the principle of Rabbi Shimon in the interpretation of Rabbah. Rabbah, in trying to resolve the contradiction between the two statements of Rabbi Shimon, formulates this understanding of Rabbi Shimon. Machshava de la minkera pasala rachamana. If the intent is not recognizably false, you can't tell, maybe that the intent is false, then it does not fulfill the owner's obligation. But if it's obviously false and there's actions that speak louder than his intent, then it is not invalid. It, in fact, fulfills the obligation of the owner. Now we're going to have a series of questions against Rabbah. Ela me'ata ola ta'of shemelaka lema'la mishum hata ta'of terase ma'aseha mochichin aleha de'ola ta'of hi di chata ta'of hi lemata have abid la. According to you, this Rabbah, in your interpretation of Rabbi Shimon, then it should be that if you have a bird that's designated as a korban olah, when it comes to birds, an olah is supposed to be killed with milika above the line, the red line. The Kohen would stand on the ledge of the Mizbeach and do milika there, and he's supposed to squeeze the blood of the bird. He takes the bird after he does milika and squeezes it, presses the neck directly onto the Mizbeach. That's how you do a korban olah. So you have a bird that's designated to be an olah, and then the Kohen he does the milika above. And however, he has in mind it's a chatat. It should be viable. It should fulfill the owner's obligation. Why? Because its action proves that it is a korban olah, since he did it above. He did everything correctly as a korban olah. If it were a korban hatat, which is what he has in mind, then it would have to be below. When it comes to birds, the law is that a korban hatat has to be, generally you do milika below, you sprinkle below the red line and squeeze it below the red line. That's another difference. In olah, everything's above the red line, only squeezing. When it comes to a hatat, you have to first sprinkle the blood. You take the bird and you wave it, and so that the blood sprinkles on the mizbeach below the line, and then you also have to squeeze it by pressing the bird against the wall of the Mizbeach. So anyway, here it's designated to be a Korban Olah. And he does it above, which is where it's supposed to be. He does Milika. He says, I am doing this for a Chatat. Yeah, but his actions speak louder than his words, and therefore it should fulfill the owner's obligation. But Rabbi Shimon doesn't say that. But this would be inconsistent with his logic. Atu hatat haof lemala mileta hamarmor milika b'chol makom b'mizbeach keshera. And we answer, Chatat of a bird, can you not do melicha above? You can. The master has taught that if you do melika anywhere on the mizbeach, it's kosher. Now, it would make more sense if it's a korban chata to do with the melika below, standing on the ground, because you're going to have to very, very quickly sprinkle the blood and squeeze the blood before it all pours out. So it would make sense. But technically, if you went up on the ledge and did the milika there, and then came down and did the sprinkling, that would be okay. So actually, the action of doing milika above is in fact ambiguous. Since it's ambiguous, because it would still be a kosher bird offering, even if you did the milika of a chatat above, therefore, we can't say that the action defines what it is. The action that he does is in fact ambiguous, and that's why it makes sense that it would not fulfill the obligation of the owner. Next question. Ola ta'of shemisada ma'ala l'shem hata ta'of teraseh. According to your explanation of Rabbi Shimon, it should be that a korban olah of a bird, where you squeeze the blood above the red line, and the Kohen does the squeezing l'shem hatat. Now, the squeezing, the same like sprinkling the blood, is one of the fundamental actions that one does, and if you do it the wrong way, it won't be good. And so here you take the korban, it's a olah, it's a bird that's an olah. So therefore the squeezing is supposed to be above, and in fact he does it above. But the Kohen says l'shem hatat. It should be okay, because the actions which he does correctly as a korban ha'of should speak louder than the words that he says that it's a chatat. The chatat ha'ofi lemata ha'abid lehazah. If it was a korban hatat, then he should do the sprinkling below the line. In fact, he's doing squeezing, and really, if it was a hatat, he would do sprinkling first and then squeezing. Here he's just doing squeezing, and he's doing it above the line. So this should be permitted according to Rabbi Shimon. It should be okay. We should ignore his intentions, and it should fulfill the obligation of the owner. But we answer this too. Amri dilma misui debatar hazaahu damar mor misa dama bechol makom b'mizbeach keshera. No, it could be that this is the squeezing that's done after the sprinkling, because the master has taught that if one did the squeezing of a korban hatat blood, after you did the sprinkling correctly, if you did the squeezing any place on the mizbeach, it's kosher. So therefore, for korban chatat, as long as you did the sprinkling below the red line, and then if you did the squeezing above the red line, it would still be a kosher sacrifice. Therefore, this too is an ambiguous action, because just by looking at what he's doing, it could be that it's a korban olah, that he's squeezing above the red line, which is correct for a korban olah, but it could be it's a korban hatat, and he already sprinkled it below, and now he's just squeezing it above, which, if you do that, b'diavad, it's okay. And therefore, this again, because the action is ambiguous, Therefore, the intention takes over, and the intention disqualifies the korban for the owner. Okay, another question. Hata ta'of sheizadama lemata l'shem ola ta'of teraseh. Demaseh mochichin aleh de hatat of he. Now you have a bird that's designated to be a korban hatat, and he sprinkled the blood below, but he had in mind, he said, this is going to be a korban olah. That should fulfill the owner's obligation. Why? Because the action proves that it's a korban hatat. It's designated to be a korban chatat, and he sprinkles the blood below. Well, sprinkling the blood is something you only do for chatat, and below is something you only do for korban chatat. So therefore, this should be clear. Di ola ta'ofi lemala hava abid le umisui hava abid le. Because if it were a korban ola, then number one, he'd have to do it above the red line. Second, he'd have to do squeezing and not sprinkling. So in this case, shouldn't Rabbi Shimon agree that it should be acceptable to its owner? We should ignore the stated intention of the Kohen because his actions will override it. In this case, the actions are not ambiguous. There's no other way to interpret his actions. And we answer, Hachinameh, you know what? You're right. In this case, Rabbi Shimon would agree. Since there's no other way to explain his actions, it can only be a korban chatat. Therefore, it fulfills his obligation as a korban chatat, and we ignore what the Kohen said, that he's doing it as an olah. So indeed, you're right, Rabbi Shimon would agree to this. Now, the problem was that Rabbi Shimon, above in his words, said that lefi she'en menachot amot lizbachim. He said mincha offerings are not the same as zevachim, and zevachim technically means anything that's slaughtered, and so we might think it includes birds. And so he was saying that korban mincha only in meal offerings. If you have the wrong intention of the type of mincha, then it's okay. But we might have thought that in bird and animal offerings, it's not okay. But actually, when he says zevachim, ka'amar lizvachim v'lo lo'afot, he meant literally something slaughtered, not birds. Birds you get milika, not actually slaughtering. So, you're right. In fact, when it comes to the realm of birds, there are some exceptions where the law would be the same as for flower offerings. Just like for flower offerings, the action proves what it is, and that overrides the wrong intention. So too, in birds, in a case like this that we just cited, that also the actions will be clear, unambiguous, and therefore override the intention, and therefore it's an acceptable korban. However, when it comes to animal offerings, they're too ambiguous. And in those cases, if he has in mind the wrong type of korban, then it will not be acceptable for its owner. Okay, good. So now we have a conclusion regarding birds. Now we're going to continue some questions from animal offerings. Kodshe kodashim sheshechatan basafon l'shem kodashim kalim lirasu. If you have an animal that's kodshe kodashim, like a korban olah, and he did shechita in the north, which is where it's supposed to be, but the Kohen has in mind, and he says, I am slaughtering this korban as a shilamim, or any other type of kadashim kalim. It should be acceptable because ma'asehen mochin alehem de kodshe kodashim ninhu, de kodashim kalim badarom hava abid lehu. The action proves that it's kodshe kodashim because he did shechita in the north, where you always do all kodshe kodashim. If it was kadashim kalim, then he would have slaughtered it in the south. So how come we don't say over here, Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabba's interpretation, that over here also it should be an acceptable korban to its owner? The answer is, Emur damar chamana af bedarom belo besafon mi amar ditnan shechitatan bechol makom ba'azara. When it comes to kadashim kalim, the Torah says, Hashem says, you can do it also in the south. But Hashem never said only in the south and not the north. We have the Mishnah Masechet Zevachim that says that Kadashim Kalim can be slaughtered anywhere in the temple courtyard. And therefore, just because he's slaughtering this particular animal in the north does not prove that it's Kodshe Kodashim. It's actually an ambiguous action. You can slaughter any sacrifice in the north. And so, this is in fact, because the action is ambiguous, the intention ruins the sacrifice for the owner. So we answer that question. Next question. Kadashim kalim sheshechatan badarom l'shem kodshe kadashim liratzu ma'asehen mochichin alehem de kadashim kalim ninhu de'i kodshe kadashim basafon hava avid lehu. What if you have a kodshe kadashim like a korban shelamim and you did shechita in the south? But he says, I am slaughtering this animal and has in mind for a korban olah or any other type of kodshe kodashim. In that case, surely wouldn't you agree that the action proves that it can't be a korban olah? He's slaughtering it in the south. If it were kodshe kodashim, would have to be in the north. So here, the action is not ambiguous. Clearly, the intention is wrong. So in that case, should we say that it will fulfill the obligation of the owner? But Rabbi Shimon said, no, the flower offerings are not the same as animal offerings, and animal offerings are not acceptable. Amri kodshe kadashim ninhu umi abad hu de'avad v'shachat lehu badaram. No, we can say it's still ambiguous, because maybe it really is designated to be a kodshe kodashim or korban olah, and this kohen transgressed. He violated, and he did the shechita in the south. So just because he's doing it in the south doesn't mean for sure it's kodashim kalim. It could be kodshe kodashim, and he made a violation and is doing shechita in the wrong place. And therefore, when he says, I am doing this for kodshe kodashim, it could be that it really is a kodshe kodashim. Just because it's in the south, maybe he's doing it wrongly in the south, but we don't know. His actions don't prove for sure that his intention is wrong, and therefore his intention will, in fact, ruin it. Wait a second. If you're going to go down that route and you're going to include the possibility that the Kohen is preparing it in the wrong way, then you should apply that also to a korban mincha. If you have a machabat offering, griddle, and he does it, the Kohen does kemitza l'shem marcheshet, you could say the same thing. When the Kohen is doing the kemitza in the name of marcheshet, you might say, maybe in fact the owner made a vow that he's going to bring a marcheshet. And the fact that he brought it in a machavat is because it's wrong. Really, he vowed to bring a marcheshet, and he did the wrong thing, and ended up bringing it in a machavat. But this is ambiguous. Just because it's in a machavat right now doesn't mean it was supposed to be. Maybe he vowed it to be a marcheshet, and therefore the Kohen's intention is true, and it is a marcheshet. Therefore, the action of being in a machavat pot is ambiguous, and therefore you would also say in flower offerings that it should not be acceptable to its owner. So why don't you apply the same logic that you just did from animals also to flower offerings? And the answer is no, you wouldn't do that. Hatam ki nameh b'marcheshet nedar ki maiteh le b'machavat havya. When it comes to flower offerings, even if he made a vow that it should be marcheshet, once he actually prepares it and brings it in a machavat, it actually becomes a machavat type of offering. Kiditnan, as we learn in a Mishnah later on, Ha'omer, hare alai b'machabat, vehevi b'marcheshet vehevi b'machabat, ma shehevi, v'idei nidro lo yasa. If someone says, I have an obligation upon myself to bring a mincha in a machavat, and then he ended up bringing it in a marcheshet. He says, I have an obligation to bring it in a marcheshet. In the end, he made a mistake and he brought it in a machavat. That which he brought, meaning it's a valid offering, except that he does not fill his original vow, because he says, I have an obligation to bring a machavat. He didn't bring a machavat. But once he brings it in a marcheshet, whatever he brings it in, even if it didn't match his vow, it becomes that type of korban. And therefore, when the Kohen takes this item, and let's say it's in a machavat, and he says, I'm doing it l'shem marcheshet, the Kohen is clearly wrong, because actually it doesn't matter what the vow was. All that matters when it comes to a flower offering is what type of pot it's in now, how it was prepared. when it comes to the Kohen. And therefore, really it doesn't matter what the Kohen says it is. The proper korban is going to be what type of pot it is in now. And that's why it's not ambiguous. We can ignore the intention of the Kohen. That's true of flour. And that is something that distinguishes flour offerings from animal offerings. When it comes to animal offerings, if he did it in the wrong place, then it doesn't turn it into a different type of korban. It remains the korban that he vowed it, however he consecrated it, remains that. Now it just is, so he messed up in the place that he did one of the actions, but it remains the vow. And so there, in animal offerings, you can say, even though it looks like this, no, it's a mistake, it really was the thing of the vow, so it's ambiguous. But in a flour offering, there's no ambiguity, because it doesn't matter what he made in the time of the vow. This korban actually will be the type of flour offering of the pot that is currently in. The Gemara follows up with another question. V'dilma amar zo lehavi b'machabat ve'havi b'marcheshet keditnan zo lehavi b'machabat ve'havi b'marcheshet ve'havi b'machabat hare zo pesula. The statement, the action is still ambiguous in a case like this, where the person brings some flour in a certain type of pot. It is still ambiguous, because it could be that the owner made a vow not using the formula hare alai, but zo. He says this flour is an obligation, has to be a mahabat. And then he brought it, instead of in a mahabat, in the marcheshet. That same Mishnah says that the law in this case is different. If he vowed and said, this flour will be brought in a mahavat, and he brought it in a marcheshet, or he said this flour must be brought in a marcheshet, and he brought it in a mahavat, it is disqualified. It does not fulfill his vow. So you see that in this case, his vow does make a difference and defines what it is. Therefore, when a certain thing comes to the Kohen, mahavat comes to the Kohen. He says, I am doing kemitzah l'shem marcheshet. It could be that it's correct. It could be that the original vow was in fact marcheshet, and therefore the fact that it's in a mahavat does not prove that it's supposed to be a mahavat. It's supposed to be a marcheshet, because he said zo lehavi b'marcheshet, and therefore when he says zo lehavi b'marcheshet, that is binding. It has to be in a marcheshet. And therefore the Kohen is correct to say marcheshet, and the action does not prove the authentic type of korban that it is. And therefore we would have a case where in a flour offering also the action is ambiguous. And since the action is ambiguous, when the Kohen does something different from the action, it should disqualify, and the korban, the mincha, should not be acceptable. Good question. The Rabbanan hachinami, and we answer, yeah, that's true for Rabbanan. This Mishnah, this whole Mishnah is only the opinion of Rabbanan. We're going to quote much later on the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees with this. Rabbi Shimon, Kevan damar Rabbi Shimon, af yedeh nidro yasa. Rabbi Shimon thinks that in these cases, the owner fulfills even his vow. Even though he said, hare alai, I'm going to bring a marcheshet, or this flour is going to be in a marcheshet. Okay, he said that, it's true. But in the end, he brings a mahavat, he still fulfills his vow. Because the language, the exact language of the neder, he thinks doesn't matter. Whatever he puts it in, that's the type of korban that it will be. And the main part of his vow is that he made a vow that he's going to bring a korban mincha. And even though he said this type instead of that type, it's okay, as long as he brought one type, even if it's not the exact same type, he fulfills his vow. That's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Alma kevi'ota demana vela kelum hu. Therefore, the designation of the vessel does not mean anything. Whatever he said about the vessel, he said, I'm going to bring it in a mahavat. I'm going to put this flour in a mahavat. This flour is going to go in a mahavat. It doesn't matter the type of vessel that he says in his neder. We ignore that statement, and all that matters is his action, what type of a vessel he actually puts it in. Velo shana amar zo, velo shana amar alai. Neither does either language matter. So you see, according to the Rabbi Shimon, everything works smoothly. Because according to the Bishimon, and it's his opinion that we're trying to figure out, Rabbah gave an interpretation of the Bishimon's opinion. And according to the Bishimon, the language of the vow doesn't make any difference. All that matters is the type of pot that is prepared in, and that he brings it to the Kohen. And therefore, what the Kohen, however it is in front of the Kohen, that is by definition what it will be. That's why it's unambiguous. The action speaks louder than the intention, and we can ignore the Kohen's intention when it comes to any type of Korban Mincha, and therefore it makes sense that according to the Bishimon, no matter what the intention was of the Kohen, since the action is clear, it fulfills the obligation of the owner. El ha'me'ata ola sheshachat l'shem chatat teraseh, tahai zachar v'hai nekeba. And now we ask, according to Rabbah's interpretation of Rabbi Shimon, it should be that if you have a korban ola and someone does shechita on it, having in mind and says this is going to be for a chatat, it should fulfill the obligation of the owner, because a korban olah has to be a male and a chatat has to be a female, and therefore there is no room for any ambiguity. Anyone who's looking at it will say, wait a second, this is a male, and when you say chatat, we'll say, oh, obviously it's not a chatat, it's a male. And that's his rule. Anytime the action is not ambiguous, then the action overrides the intention. And the answer is actually there is a type of korban chatat that's a male, and that's of a nasi. If a king makes an error, then he brings a goat that is a male, and therefore it actually is possible that even though this is a male animal and he says chatat, could be he has in mind that it's a sa'ir for a nasi, and therefore it's actually ambiguous. And since the action is ambiguous, therefore it cannot, for the intention is relevant, and it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. Okay, what if the guy who's doing shechita says it's designated to be a korban olah, it's a male, and he says, I'm doing this shechita for the sake of an individual chatat, a regular person, not a nasi, which is always a female. So that would not be ambiguous. Okay, you know that the intention is wrong. Vetu chatat yachid shechata l'shem olah teraseh techatat nekeba ve'olah zachar. Or the other way around, if it's a korban chatat that a regular individual brings, which is a female, and then person does shechita and he says, for the sake of an olah, also according to the Bishimon, it should be a valid korban and fulfill the obligation of the owner, because the animal is a nekeva. So clearly the action that he says it's an olah is going to be nullified, because an olah has to be a zachar. So good questions. How come it to be Shimon, according to Rabbah, would not permit these cases? And the answer is mikasya be'aliyah. We're talking about a sheep that has a fat tail, and its genitalia are covered by the tail, and so you can't see. No, the people around can't tell. Person doing shechita is not easily able to see if it's a male or a female, and therefore, since the action is not easily noticeable and ambiguous, therefore the wrong intention ruins it. Fine, that's good if he brings a lamb that has a fat tail and covers its genitalia. But what if he brings a female goat that has just a very small tail and does not cover its genitalia, and so someone looking can see if it's male or female? But we answer to that also that most people are not distinguishing between male and female animals, although if you look carefully you can tell, but most people are not looking carefully, and therefore that's considered too hard to tell. It's the action is ambiguous. And since the action is not easily noticeable, therefore the intention that he says wrong ruins it and does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. All right, we'll try again. Another challenge. Pesach sheshechato l'shem asham liraseh dahai ben shana v'hai ben shetayim. If it's a korban Pesach and he does shechita and he says this is for an asham, maybe that also should be okay because a Pesach has to be within its first year, but Asham has to be within its second year since birth. So different age, so isn't that clear that that this has to be a Korban Pesach and not an Asham, and therefore his intention should be nullified by the reality on the ground. No, actually still ambiguous because the Asham that a Nazir brings and Asham that a Mesorah brings are also 1 year old. And so when he says it's for an Asham, could be it is an Asham for a Nazir and a Mesorah, and therefore that action is not clear. And when the action is not clear, the wrong intention nullifies the act. Amar l'shum asham gezelot u'shum asham me'ilot ma'ika lememad. Okay, what if he actually delineates and says it's supposed to be a korban pesach, and he says I'm doing shechita on this for the sake of a regular asham gezelot or asham me'ilot, which are in their second year, and this animal is in its first year. So it's clear that his intention makes no sense. We should ignore the intention. The wrong intention, and therefore say it's a totally valid sacrifice. And the other way around also should be okay. If it's actually an Asham Gezelot or Asham Me'ilot that are 2 years old, and you did Shechita, this is L'Shem Korban Pesach. But Pesach is only 1 year old, and these are 2 years old. So these are clearly identifiable, and since it's unambiguous, clearly identifiable action, the action should speak louder than the wrong intention. La ben shana leben shete shanim la vaday atayhu de inashe tika ben shana de michse keben shetayim vika ben shetayim de michse keben shana. Rather, also, most people find it hard to distinguish between a 1 year old and a 2 year old animal. Sometimes there's a 1 year old that looks like a 2 year old. Sometimes a 2 year old that looks like a 1 year old. There's always that kid in the class that's taller than everybody else. He got left behind in kindergarten. Sometimes it's hard to know how old an animal really is, and therefore that's considered ambiguous. And since the action is ambiguous, the wrong intention makes it invalid. Sa'ir sheshechato l'shum asham liraseh tahai semer v'hai se'ar. Okay, what if you had a goat that's a korban hatat, and you did shechita for the sake of an asham? So that seems that should be good because the asham is a ram or a sheep, which is white wool, and the goat that he brings as a hatat is black hair, and so these clearly look different, right? No, not necessarily. Amri dichra ukamahu. It could be a black sheep, a ram. A ram is a male sheep, and so it could be a black sheep. Well, most sheep are white, but some are black, and so the person looking, if they're not looking carefully, will think that that maybe it is. And since the action is ambiguous, the intention will ruin that also. So that's why it doesn't work there. Egel ufaz sheshechatan l'shum pesach v'asham liratzu de'egel upar v'pesach v'asham leka. Okay, last question. What if someone brings a calf or a bull, a large animal? He brings it for something, and then an olah, or let's say, and then the kohen, whoever is doing shechita, says, "I'm doing this l'shem korban pesach," or for an asham. Now, this can't be because egel and pad, for a pesach and hasham, there's no such thing. A korban pesach has to be a sheep or a goat. Hasham also cannot be a big calf or a bull, and so there's no ambiguity here. And here, Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbah's reasoning, should say that this korban is valid and it fulfills the obligation of the owner, because it's impossible for this animal to be a korban pesach or an asham, and since the action speaks louder than the intentions, therefore we should throw out the intentions and follow the actions, and it should be valid. And the answer is, in achinameh. You're right. Rabbi Shimon would certainly have to agree in that case. Umay zevachim. Well, then what does the word zevachim mean? Back when Rabbi Shimon gave his reasoning and said, oh, there's a difference between zevachim and menaḥot. When it comes to menaḥot, the action proves what it is. And zevachim, every shechita is the same. Every sprinkling is the same. When he said zevachim, everything is the same. What does he mean? It's not true. Here's an example of zevachim where the shechita of a pod clearly is not for a Pesach. And the answer is Rov Zevachim. When he said that, he was talking about most of the cases. Most of the cases of a Korban Mincha are not ambiguous, and therefore, in most cases of a Korban Mincha, if he has the wrong intention, it's okay. It'll still fulfill the obligation of the owner. But regarding Korbanot, look, we just went through a lot of examples. Most examples of Korbanot, there is some ambiguity and someone might make a mistake, and therefore the intention overrides the action. Oh, but it's true, in those few cases regarding birds, we saw a case like that regarding birds, and in some cases of animals too, since the action is clear, there's no other way to interpret it. Yes, in fact, in such cases, even if the person doing shechita says l'shem some other korban, we can ignore his actions if indeed the action, we can ignore his intention if indeed the action is not ambiguous. Rava amar la kashya kan bekometz mincha leshum mincha kan bekometz mincha leshum zevach. And now we have the second answer of Rava. The question was, Rabbi Shimon has two baraitot. At first he is lenient and says if someone makes a korban mincha for, it was supposed to be one type, mahavat, and then he does kimitzah, l'shem marcheshet. The first statement of Rabbi Shimon says, it's okay, he fulfills his obligation. The second statement says, although it's valid, but he does not fulfill the obligation. So we saw already the answer of Rabbah, and now the answer of Rava is, no, there's no problem. When he was lenient, the first baraita, that was talking about where he does kemitzah for something that is one type of mincha, and he says it's a different type of mincha. But two korban minchas, they're within the same category. So it's good enough. As long as it's some type of korban mincha, it fulfills the obligation. You can switch from one to the other. But the second baraita, where it's no good, is when it's clearly flour. So he's taking a kemitzah. It's supposed to be a korban mincha, and he says this is for the sake of a korban, an animal korban, a korban shelamim, a korban olah, whatever. So that is such a different category that is clearly totally bad. And so for Rava, he has the opposite methodology as Rabbah. Rabbah says, if it's clearly wrong, then, you know what, we can ignore the intention. Action speaks louder than words. Rabbah is thinking the opposite. The more clearly contradictory it is, then the worse it is, and we throw it out. If it's close enough, then it's okay. But he has a source also, Rava. Mincha l'shum mincha vezot Torat ha-mincha. Torah achat l'chol menaḥot. Mincha l'shum zevach vezot Torat ha-mincha vezevach lo ketib. When you do, if it's supposed to be one type of mincha, and he does kemitzah for the sake of a different type of mincha, that's okay, because the pasuk says, this is the law of the mincha. The law means one law for all menaḥot. It's okay. You designate it as a mahabat, but now you said it's for marcheshet. That's okay. One law for all any mincha, and it's valid, fulfills the obligation. But there's no pasuk that says this is a law for mincha and zebach. Since there's no pasuk, those are separate categories. They cannot overlap, and it's totally contradictory, and it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. Wait a second, you're giving a new reason, a pasuk for Rabbi Shimon. But Rabbi Shimon in the Baraita said a reason. He said it's because its actions prove what it is. I mean, that's how we understood it before. The actions speak louder than the intention, so we can ignore the intention, and that's why it's valid. Didn't explain the reason, but now you're bringing a pasuk, and your pasuk is actually your logic is the opposite of this. Hachi ka'amad, af agav demachshava dela min kerahi v'tipasel bezot Torah mincha, Torah achat lechol menaḥot. He's going to explain these words in the way the opposite of how we understood them. Even though the intention is not clear that it can be what it's supposed to be, right? Even though the intention, the stated intention, this is a korban marcheshet, but that is not clear that it fits what it is. In fact, even if it's totally contradictory and clear that it's not. And so therefore you would think it should be pasul, because for Rava, the more contradictory it is, the worse. So even if it's not something that's clear that it could match, and in fact even more, if it's even worse, if it's totally different, and you'd think it should be no good, but the pasuk comes in to save the day and say, no, it's one law for all korban minchas, and therefore any korban mincha with any intention, as long as the intention was for some type of korban mincha, that's okay. All right, now we ask what the continuation of Rabbi Shimon's words says. Umay aval bezvachim enoken. He makes a distinction and said with zevachim it's not so. In what way is zevachim not like that? How come you don't say the same thing in zevachim, that if the intention is contradictory, then what? How are you interpreting this phrase? And the answer is Af agav de shchita achat lechulan vezot Torah mincha vezebach laketib. Okay, when he said for zevachim it's not so, he explained when it comes to zevachim, there's the shechita is the same for all of them. The point is like this: even though for shechita, since the action is the same for any type of korban, and therefore the intention is not clearly contradictory, and so there maybe you think, you know what? The intention we can let the intention go because it's not so clearly contradictory. So in fact, zevachim in a way conceptually is better, is more easily lenient. But it's not so because there is no pasuk that says this is the law of the mincha and the zevach. So you see Rava saying we follow the pasuk. Since there is a pasuk about korban mincha, they're all the same. Therefore, intention, even when the intention is contradictory, that's okay. But regarding zevachim, even though zevachim are more similar to each other in reality because they look alike, the action looks alike and is not clearly contradictory, nevertheless, they're going to be invalid for the owner, not fulfill the owner's obligation, because there is no pasuk like that. It all goes by the language of the pasuk. Ele me'ata, hatat chayleb sheshechata, l'shem chatat dam, l'shum chatat avodah zara, l'shum chatat nazir, l'shum chatat mesorah, tekeshera utraseh, damarachamana vezot, Torah chatat, Torah achat, l'chol chatat. Wait, according to your methodology, Rava, then it should be that if one has to bring a korban hatat because he ate cheleb, so he brings a chatat, I'm bringing this chatat because I ate cheleb. And then when the person does shechita, he says this is going to be for the sake of a hatat for someone who eats blood, or for a chatat of avodah zarah, or the chatat that the nazir has to bring, or the chatat that the mesorah has to bring. According to your logic, it should be okay because the pasuk says this is the law of the chatat, so it should be one law for all chatat, and therefore even if you change the intention from one type of chatat, a chatat for one sin, to chatat for another sin, it should be okay. Would you say that? And the answer is yes. Rabbi Shimon tachinameh. If it's following Rabbi Shimon, yes, Rabbi Shimon would say that if you switch from one type of chatat to another, it was designated for a cheleb, but then he said, I'm doing shechita for dam, that's okay. L'Rabanan, ha'amar chatat cheleb shechatat l'shem chatat dam, l'shum chatat avodah zarah keshera. Rabbanan, he also would agree in some of these cases, if it was a chatat cheleb, and then someone did shechita, saying this is a chatat for dam or a chatat for avodah zarah, that's okay because they're similar enough. If, on the other hand, he says l'shem chatat nazir mesorah, chatat nazir or mesora pesula tahani olot be'adai huninhu. If it's supposed to be a chatat for chelib, and he says this is a chatat for a nazir or this is a chatat for a mesora, then it's no good. It is not. It is not going to fulfill the obligation of the owner, because a nazir and a mesorah have to also bring a korban olah. So they're completely different. And besides that, nazir and mesorah didn't actually make a sin. This is just part of their purification process. So they have to bring that, and unlike the other people that made sins. So because he has to also bring a korban olah, that shows it's a different category. His chatat itself is a different category from the other ones, and therefore the Rabbanan would say in those cases they're no good. And the last opinion about this point is Rav Acha bered Rava matne le lekuluhu lepsula v'shachat otah lechatat l'shem oto chatat. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, he has a baraita that says that all of these cases are no good, because the pasuk says you shall slaughter it as a chatat. It's limiting. It says, meaning you have to have in mind that specific sin, that specific type of chatat. Otherwise, if it's supposed to be chelib and you have in mind dam, it's all no good. But that's okay. Rava only needed to answer the question according to the Shimon, because he at first was only trying to explain the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rav Asher Amar la kasha kan bekomes minchat machabat l'shum marcheshet, kan bekomes minchat machabat l'shum minchat marcheshet. Rav Asher gives the third answer, that there's no contradiction between the two statements of Rabbi Shimon. The first one, where he is lenient, is a case where he does kemitzah of flour that is designated to be a minchat machabat, supposed to be on a griddle, and it is in fact on a griddle. It's prepared in that way, and he says for the sake of a marcheshet, not for the sake of a korban marcheshet, for minchat marcheshet, but rather for a marcheshet, which means for a deep pan. So he's doing kemitzah. He has this thing. It's a griddle. It's on a griddle, prepared on a griddle, and now he takes it and says, "I'm doing kemitzah for the sake of a deep pan." Well, that's nonsensical. There's no such thing as a mincha for the sake of a deep pan, as he'll explain in a second. Whereas when he's stringent and says it does not fulfill the owner's obligation, that's where he takes something that is minchat machavat. It is supposed to be, it was designated as a griddle and prepared on a griddle, and he says, I'm doing kemitzah for the sake of a mincha of a marcheshet. There, the intention applies. The intention is relevant, and therefore it's relevant, but it's wrong, and so it does not fulfill the owner's obligation. And he explains, Minchat machavat l'shum marcheshet b'mana kamechashev u'machshava b'mana la pasla. When he says, I'm doing this korban, he takes a minchat machavat, and he says, for the sake of a deep pan, that's just a tool, that's just a vessel. And he's thinking about a vessel, and thinking about a vessel is not going to make it pasul. He does kemitzah. He says, I'm doing this kemitzah for a hammer. What does a hammer have to do with the korban mincha? Nothing. So therefore we can ignore his intention, and it's a perfectly good korban. Whereas minchat machavat l'shum minchat marcheshet b'minchat pasla ba machshava kamechashev. But when he says that he takes a minchat machavat and he says for the sake of a minchat marcheshet, there he's thinking about another type of mincha. And in that case, pasla ba machshava, his intention makes it invalid, and that's what since that's what he is intending with something that would make it invalid, so it does in fact disqualify it. Okay, that's a very nice logic, Rav Asher, but how does it fit with the words of Rabbi Shimon? He said the reason why it's okay is because its action proves what it is. So that sounds more like what Rabbah said. How does Rav Asher's reasoning fit into the words? And the answer is similar to what Rabbah said. Hachi ka'amar, afal gav de machshava min kadhi tipasel. Even though the intention makes it clear that it's wrong, and you would think that it should be pasul, even though the intention is contradictory, is not what it is. It's not a hammer. It's not a deep pan. And so, even though it's clear that it's wrong, and you would think it's pasul, no, nevertheless, it's okay. That's what he means. Umay aval bizvachim enoken. So how about the continuation that makes a contrast between Menaḥot and zevachim, and says, no, zevachim not so, because there's one shechita for all of them. What is that supposed to mean? Afal gav de shechita achat lechulan, zirika achat lechulan, kabbalah achat lechulan, bezbicha de pasla b'machshava kamechashev. It's there he's saying, even though the action is one and the same. There's one, you do shechita for all types of animals, zirika looks the same for all of them, kabbalah looks the same for all types of animals, and therefore you would think that when he has intention for a different type of korban, you would think that maybe it's okay because the stated intention is similar to the action that you would do for the stated intention if it's asham. And he had in mind olah. He says this is for an olah. So since the action for an asham or for an olah is similar anyway, you might think that it's okay. But it's not okay because he is not thinking of a vessel, he's thinking of another type of zevicha. And if you have in mind a different type of korban, then it will make it pasul, and therefore it's pasul. Amar le Rav Acha bered Rava le Rav Asher, hareva mishum belula, amai amar Rabbi Shimon, amar le shum bila be'alma. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, asks Rav Asher, what if it's supposed to be a dry mincha offering? That's the one that a hoter brings, a sinner brings, no oil. So he brings just this plain flour, and he does kemitzah for the sake of belula. Belula means literally just mixed. He means for the sake of a korban mincha that's mixed with oil. How come Rabbi Shimon said that in that case it would fulfill the owner's obligation? After all, he is having in mind a different type of korban. He doesn't have in mind a tool, and so therefore it should be pasul, and it should not fulfill the obligation of the owner. So how come Rabbi Shimon said that hareva mishum belula would be one of the cases where it would be permitted? Amale lishum bila be'alma. No, when he says belula, he doesn't mean I'm doing this for the sake of a korban mincha that requires putting with oil and doing this whole thing. If he said something like that, like if it was a chareva, and he said, for the sake of a minchat marcheshet, where you're actually naming another type of korban, then it's pasul. But when he says belula, he has in mind just the mixing. I'm taking this flour, I'm doing kemitzah for the sake of mixing flour and oil. That's not the name of a korban. It's just an action of mixing, not a korban. And therefore, it's like saying for the sake of a hammer. And so we ignore the intention and the korban is fine. Wait a second. If so, why don't you apply that case also to a case, let's say he brings a olah. It's an olah. And the one doing shechita says, for the sake of shelamim, you could say, for the sake of peace between the person and Hashem. So, because shelamim can also mean just a regular noun, and so therefore, since it's like just a regular noun, it's the same as saying for the sake of a hammer. And we can ignore that intention, and it should be valid in the case of an asham that you made it for shelamim. So, because if you're going to just say a word can have a regular meaning, like belula, so say the same for shelamim. Hachi hashta? No, these two cases are not the same at all. Hatam zevach kufa ikre shelamim, dichtiva makri bedam hashelamim, hazorek edam hashelamim. In that case, the type of korban itself is called shelamim in the Torah. If someone sacrifices the blood of a shelamim, you don't translate it as the blood of peace. No, it's the blood of the shelamim. It's the type of offering. Or someone who throws the blood of the shelamim, the peace offering. In Hebrew, it's just one word. Hacha mincha gufa mi'ikre belula. But do you ever call a mincha a mixture? You never call it that. V'chol mincha belula b'shemen ketib. Belula b'shemen ikre, belula setama la'ikre. A mincha that's mixed with oil is called belula b'shemen. Yes, that's the name of it. But it's never called just belula. And so since that's not the word belula by itself is not the name of a korban, therefore, when he says, I'm doing this kemitzah for the sake of belulah, for the sake of mixing. For mixing what? Mixing a brownie mix, mixing whatever. It's no relevance to the korban because it's not a type of korban mincha. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen ve'amen.